Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Sunday, the 5th of November. I'm Andrew Wilson, and welcome to the Full Scottish. This afternoon, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 620 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I will introduce our guests for this afternoon, and then together we will take a look in a little more depth at the past week's key headlines from Scotland and around the world. Talks are underway to outline what Ukraine might have to give up to secure a peace deal with Russia, US news channel NBC reported earlier, citing a senior US official and another former senior official who briefed the network about the tentative plans. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky reaffirmed his stance that this is not the time to negotiate with Russia, and he also denied that any Western leaders were pressuring him to do so. Zelensky also rejected remarks by his own commander-in-chief that the war had reached a stalemate. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen arrived in Kyiv yesterday ahead of a report the EU is expected to present next week about Ukraine's progress in its membership bid. She said the EU would stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes, and that the country had made excellent progress towards EU accession. Ukraine attacked a Russian shipyard in the port city of Kerch in the occupied Crimean Peninsula yesterday, damaging a Russian ship, according to the Russian Defense Ministry. A Ukrainian official said the Russian Navy stationed one of its most modern caliber cruise missile ships there. Russian forces are now focused on capturing Avdiivka's coking plant, according to the town's mayor, Vitaly Barabash. He said audio transmission intercepts had revealed that Moscow was now seeking to secure it. But UK intelligence suggests that Russia has incurred heavy losses in its assault on the Donbass town. Ukraine said it has filed criminal charges against Patriarch Kirill, the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church, in absentia for justifying Russia's invasion. Moscow's most influential spiritual leader, a fervent supporter of President Vladimir Putin, has called the war a historic battle against the forces of evil. President Zelensky appointed a new commander of the country's special forces, a unit known for conducting military operations in Moscow-held territories. And Ukraine's newly appointed head of the defence industry says he is working tirelessly to ramp up local arms production, and he wants to turn the country into a weapons production hub for the West. Now, we are lucky enough this afternoon to be joined by two fantastic guests. Marion Fellows is the SNP MP for Motherwell and Wishaw. She spent almost 20 years teaching business studies at West Lothian College. She represented Wishaw as a local councillor from 2012 to 2015 and was first elected to Westminster at the general election in 2015. Marion is now the SNP Westminster spokesperson on disabilities, and she's also chair of the Post Office's all-party parliamentary group. Marion, good afternoon. How are you keeping?
I'm very well and looking forward to this afternoon's programme.
Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon, Marion. We're very grateful to you. We're also joined this afternoon by Ian Fraser. Ian was born in Edinburgh and has a degree in English from St Andrews University. He's worked as a journalist for around 30 years, writing for titles including the Financial Times, the Sunday Times, the Guardian, the Independent, Reuters, the Herald and the Sunday Herald. In his book Shredded, Inside RBS, the Bank That Broke Britain, he explores the series of cataclysmic misjudgments, the toxic internal culture and the light-touch regulatory regime that gave rise to the RBS NatWest's near collapse. Ian, good afternoon. How are you?
Good afternoon. Very well, thanks.
Well, thank you both to you for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland this afternoon. Now, firstly, when bombing hospitals and bombing ambulances are justified by the Israeli army, does the conduct of the war in Gaza give any clue to the future for a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine, while attacks on Palestinians by settlers and the Israeli Defense Force in the West Bank are increasing? This morning, the Health Ministry in Gaza says that more than 30 people were killed in an Israeli bombing of the Maghasi refugee camp in central Gaza late last night. That's according to Agence France Presse. More than 30 dead arrived at Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital in Deir al-Balah in the massacre committed by the occupation in Al-Maghasi camp in central Gaza Strip, a Health Ministry spokesperson, Ashraf Al-Qudra, said in a statement. The Palestinian news agency Wafa earlier said 51 Palestinians had been killed and scores wounded in the bombardment. Also, an Israeli drone struck near 2 ambulances on their way to pick up casualties from overnight strikes in southern Lebanon, wounding 4 paramedics, according to local officials who spoke to Agence France-Presse. It was claimed that the drone directly targeted 2 ambulances that were heading south to attend several people wounded in an Israeli strike that hit a house overnight. Local medical officials told Associated Press that the Lebanese army and the Red Cross transported the wounded paramedics to a hospital in Tyre. And according to the Times of Israel, a cabinet minister from the extremist Otzma Yehudit party says that one of Israel's options in the war in Gaza is to drop a nuclear weapon on the Strip. Asked in an interview with radio called Barama whether an atomic bomb should be dropped on the enclave, Heritage Minister Amchai Eliyahu says this is one of the possibilities. Eliyahu, who is of Itamar Ben-Gvir's far-right party, is not part of the Security Cabinet, which is involved in wartime decision-making, nor, it said, does he hold sway over the War Cabinet, which is currently directing the war in Gaza. Asked about the fate of the Palestinian population, he said they can go to Ireland or the deserts. The monsters in Gaza should find a solution by themselves. He says that the northern strip has no right to exist, adding that anyone waving a Palestinian flag shouldn't continue living on the face of the earth. Now, the Israeli opposition leader, Yair Lapid, has called for Benjamin Netanyahu to fire Eliyahu over his comments that nuclear weapons were an option. On social media, former Prime Minister Lapid wrote, "A shocking and crazy statement by the irresponsible minister. He has harmed the families of the abductees, harmed Israeli society, and harmed our international standing. The presence of the extremists in the government endangers us and the success of the war goals, the victory over Hamas, and the return of the kidnapped." Now, Ian, I noticed that you tweeted last night, Israel's claims of self-defense are now ringing hollow. The country has embarked on a dangerous course of collective punishment, making no attempt to distinguish between civilian and military targets, which has become utterly disproportionate. And you said the International Criminal Court must act. Now, firstly, you can help us. What sort of response have you received to that tweet last night? And also, on top of that, do you see any sign at the moment of Israeli blind rage and furious anger abating in the conflict in Gaza?
I mean, the response has been fairly muted, to be honest. I think it was quite outspoken. I was just really angry last night with what was going on, and I think that the worst ones were basically accusing me of being anti-Semitic by saying that, but I'm not anti-Semitic. I was basically saying that the Israeli state, as led by Netanyahu, should reconsider what it is doing in Gaza, which is potentially a war crime. And there seems to be no sign of that. Benny Gantz, who is the war minister, was either yesterday or the day before, was asked by Sky News, Mark Stone, what he felt about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. And he replied, basically, all that matters is to break Hamas and to get back the hostages. Everything else is details. So as far as Benny Gantz, who is a senior politician in the Israeli government at the moment, the fact that 10,000 Palestinians in Gaza have already been slaughtered, and of whom at least around 4,000 are children, he sees that as details. And I think that is quite concerning. And maybe it is something that the International Criminal Court should be looking at. It was also quite chilling on the 28th of October when Benjamin Netanyahu made his call, or called on Israelis to remember what the Amalek have done to you. Amalek, I'm not an avid reader of the Bible, but I subsequently discovered that this is a group of people who attacked the Israelites back in 500 BC or before, and that God had instructed Saul to go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. So this is invoking an earlier genocide. And I think it's quite concerning when a supposedly civilized nation like Israel should be invoking biblical genocides and saying that suggesting that they ought in some way to be repeated.
Thank you, Ian. And Marion, excuse me. Yesterday, the UNRWA, UNRWA, which is the UN Agency for Palestine Refugees, tweeted, "There is no water, there is no food, there is no life. These are children. Shame on you. What did we do wrong?" And the UN has also gone on to warn of a catastrophic situation for children in Gaza as Israeli bombs hit a school that was being used as a shelter and also landed outside a hospital. Israel has come under mounting pressure over the civilian casualties caused by its campaign, but more than 40% of the dead in Gaza after nearly 4 weeks of war are children. And the UN has said that there are 3,900 reported child victims and another more than 1,200 missing, presumed buried under buildings. With little rescue machinery and hospitals overcrowded and running out of supplies, the UN says the chances of survival for those trapped in the rubble are painfully low. Finally, the UN has said that over the last 29 days, an average of 130 children have been killed each day in Gaza. So, Marion, do you think we're now at a stage where we really must get the finger out and organise some form of kinder transport to stop more children dying in Gaza?
I think something has to be done. Now, the idea of kinder transport, it sounds good, but can it be done? You've referred in an earlier conversation with me, Andrew, on Martin Docherty-Hughes' idea of getting hospital ships out there. No matter what is going on in the ground, we need to rescue children. We need to make life better for folk in Gaza, and we need, as an international community led by, by Western countries, to actually get something done. We can't go on like this. I've only spoken once in Parliament on this issue. I mean, as you can understand, there's lots of people who want to speak all the time, and I could only speak really as a grandmother, mother, and its children, innocent people are being killed by, I think you could safely say, an Israeli government that isn't even supported by most of its population. I think Benjamin Netanyahu's polling ratings, and it's a terrible thing to introduce at this time, is only 27% positive. Now that's ridiculous. And there's a government running riot against innocent people, and it's time for the international community to make a stand and do something. UNRWA are absolutely right. All these children being killed is not allowable. We need to find a way to stop it. And if it's humanitarian causes, a phrase I hate, we call for a ceasefire, which may not be observed, but 4 hours this afternoon is not going to be enough to change the stuff on the ground. But really, international leaders should be calling summits and getting something done. And the UK government should step up and play a leading role.
Thank you, Marion. And finally on this topic, Ian, I was talking about an attack last night in southern Lebanon. And while there are attacks on Palestinians by settlers and the IDF in the West Bank, and they're increasing, what do you think are the risks of the current conflict in Gaza spilling over into other areas and other countries in the Middle East?
Well, can I just quickly say, I do utterly condemn what Hamas did on the 7th of October, which was barbaric and medieval and atrocious. And I abhor and utterly condemn what happened on that day. But I do also agree with the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, who says it didn't happen in a vacuum. And as far as the spread is concerned, I think this is a real danger. This is what Blinken has been focused on for the last 3 weeks. He's been traveling around the Middle East, visiting the heads of state and heads of government of almost every country in the region. And, he's desperately trying to ensure that it doesn't become a wider conflagration. So, I mean, the trouble is, the more Israel pursues its revenge strategy of indiscriminate murder and killing of innocent civilians in Gaza, the more likely it is that other countries, including Iran, and obviously Hezbollah, who are basically part of Iran, or very close to Iran, will come in, and you will see a wider war. So it's up to the Israelis to try and become slightly more responsible, and for the world community to show better leadership than they have to date. I think the critical mistake that both Joe Biden and Rishi Sunak made in the immediate aftermath of 7th of October was to give carte blanche to Netanyahu's government to do whatever he wanted in response to the attack of 7th of October.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ian. And your point, the point that you made there is absolutely right. I think we all condemn the violence and the killing on both sides and the suffering that both sides are encountering just now. But let's move on, because toxic, misogynist and incompetent are not really the adjectives you want to hear about the operation of our government during a pandemic. So did this week's evidence at the UK's COVID inquiry give an insight into just how dysfunctional the UK government is? When democracy can be so easily put aside by political advisers who stopped cabinet briefings, stopped Cobra meetings, and denied the involvement of the devolved governments, and tried to keep Boris Johnson isolated. I wonder whether the structures of government in the UK are broken beyond repair. Before the public inquiry into the handling of the COVID pandemic had taken a single minute of evidence, it was already established that Boris Johnson was a wholly unsuitable character to be leading any country through the biggest peacetime emergency in more than a century. We knew he was too selfish, too weak, too immoral, too capricious, too negligent, and too frivolous. What the inquiry is adding to the familiar portrait of Mr. Johnson is detailed and compelling testimony from people who were in the room about how utterly unfit, ethically, intellectually, temperamentally, and in any other way you might choose to mention, he was to be Prime Minister. His Cabinet Secretary, his principal private secretary, his most senior political aide, his Director of Communications, and his Chief Scientific Advisor, very different personalities with very different perspectives, all agree on one thing: Johnson was comprehensively incapable of doing the job. Very much mirroring his character, the Johnson-era Downing Street was a nasty place dominated by macho posturers with unfounded self-regard. Sexism was rife, other toxic behaviours rampant, and vicious vendettas a constant. Johnson himself complained it had turned into a totally disgusting orgy of narcissism, which to me is a bit like Count Dracula moaning that he can't stand the sight of blood. His chronic inability to make decisions on issues of critical importance was the despair of everyone around him. Sir Patrick Vallance, the chief scientific officer, would return home to pour his grief into a diary he never intended for public consumption. Quite bonkers, he wrote of one conversation with the Prime Minister. Ridiculous flip-flopping, he shudders after another dire day in Downing Street. 1 minute do more, next minute do nothing. It's like bipolar decision-making. In a further entry, he sighs, chaos as usual. So, Marion, are we now learning in detail just how unfit Johnson was and also how unsuitable the current institutions of government in Westminster were and are?
Well, I don't think it was a great surprise to anyone to find out how unsuitable Boris Johnson was as a Prime Minister. And I think it was pretty well known throughout the Tory party as well. But they thought, he's a great campaigner, he'll get Brexit done, and this is the result. The fact that his chief political advisor can isolate him, decide not to have cabinet meetings, shows a real dereliction of duty on behalf of Boris Johnson. Not surprising, but absolutely disgusting. I don't think I've never spoken directly to him, but I know from listening to gossip in the tea room, if that's the right version of events, how many Tories backed him just simply because he could win elections. And that really is the big flaw in the Tory party and in the way government's been allowed to run just now. Special advisors are useful. Everybody needs people who are expert in their areas to help them make the best decisions. But if you allow one person like Dominic Cummings, foul-mouthed, I think pretty misogynistic himself, and sometimes a mirror image of Boris Johnson, in as much as if he felt that if he did anything that was right, hence going to test your eyes, driving about County Durham, it just seems that it's time to draw a line under this. Now, I don't know. I know there were moves, I don't know officially, but there were moves to close down the Cabinet Office and to open a number 10 office. And with the fiasco with the press office Boris Johnson wanted, all of that shows that if you get someone in government who doesn't have the best interests of the country, even if you fundamentally disagree with how he goes about it, then that's really the problem. So what we need is more serious politicians who are not just looking for the next photo opportunity or the next bit of speaking that you can make a lot of money out of, because it's absolutely, it makes me incandescent to think that both Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings, even going far back as all the previous prime ministers, are making a fortune now on the after dinner speaking circuit, when what we should have in government are people who are serious and who want to help.
Thank you, Marion. That was some very good points well made there. Ian, thinking more generally, what have you been taking from the press coverage of the inquiry this week? After all, it struck me that the press, both print and broadcast, played quite an important role in putting Johnson into Downing Street.
Yes, I haven't been following it that avidly, but I think that papers like the Mail and the Telegraph and the Express, which are still, which are basically right-wing titles, which I think still are slightly in awe of Boris Johnson. And in fact, he has a column in the Mail now, are downplaying, a lot of the findings. But one thing I would say is that, an avid reader of Twitter, or X as it's now called, or an avid reader of the Sunday Times, who did a fantastic job in exposing some of this a year and a half ago, would have known most of the things that have come out from the inquiry. Johnson believed that the UK was being pathetic, which is a word he particularly likes, about COVID, and that they should have just had a cold shower and let it rip through the population. Some of these things were already out in the public domain. The fact that he told aides he sympathized with the view that COVID was nature's way of dealing with old people, that was already partially out in the public domain. The fact that he asked senior government scientists whether people might be able to kill COVID by using a special hairdryer up their noses, after watching a YouTube video about this online, that was new. I think I hadn't actually heard that one before, unless I'm mistaken. But no, I mean, overall, the coverage, I think, has been pretty weak. I think it's the more left-leaning titles, such as The Mirror, The Guardian, Independent, to some extent, which are, probably covering this better. And as far as the right-wing titles are concerned, it's probably being minimised. But then in Scotland, you've got the added complexity of the missing WhatsApps. The Scottish government, there's a big story in certain Scottish papers about the fact that WhatsApp messages from Scottish government politicians have not been given to the UK COVID inquiry yet. But I think this is probably a bit of a storm in a teacup, because I think Nicola Sturgeon has said that she can't reveal much ahead of her own evidence to the inquiry being submitted. I mean, I don't know what the protocols are, but that's what she has claimed. Anyway, it'll all come out in the wash, and eventually we'll know the extent to which Scottish government WhatsApps were or were not deleted.
Thanks, Ian. Marion, I was going to ask you about that. Ian, I'll come back to you. But Marion, I was going to ask you about that very topic. There's been quite a lot of press coverage this week. We've heard an awful lot of noise, but not an awful lot in the way of facts from Glenn Campbell and BBC Scotland and the Sunday Times about supposed WhatsApp messages in the Scottish government. Marion, what do you think's going on?
Oh, I think it's an anti-SNP story. I mean, government isn't conducted, or shouldn't be, and I don't believe was conducted over WhatsApp. You use WhatsApp to get people around the room into a meeting, to get them in around a table and to talk about the issues in front of you. And subjects Well, that's my own view. I mean, that's how I use WhatsApp. I've no reason to disbelieve anyone who says that there was nothing important in the WhatsApps. And I noticed that the stuff that was being put out on Jason Leach has really fallen right off a cliff now. I think there's a story there about what has and hasn't been given to the inquiry, but my understanding is that Shona Robertson has said that everything that they've got will be sent to the inquiry tomorrow.
Thanks, Marion. And Ian, to expand that point a little bit, I was wondering, do you have a view as to why the media in Scotland continues to insist that everything must be viewed and reported through the prism of Westminster? If Johnson's government is catastrophically incompetent, then every government is catastrophically incompetent. If Boris Johnson's government makes policy by WhatsApp, then every government must make policy by WhatsApp, even if that's simply not true. So why do you think that the media in Scotland continue to insist that everything has to be viewed through the prism of Westminster? And do you think there's any prospect of that prism being changed anytime soon?
Well, I think the saying when I worked for Scottish papers was, you've got to hang a kilt on the story, which is basically, give it a Scottish angle. But I think in this case, they're probably going too far, because the real story is the revelations from the COVID inquiry in London, and the situation with the Scottish WhatsApps and how WhatsApp was used by Scottish officials and Scottish leaders is probably a sideshow. But I mean, I suppose the overall issue is that you have got what could be considered to be a very, well, not which could be considered, which is a very pro-union media in Scotland. You've got, I can't remember the exact numbers, but you've got something like 15 daily and Sunday newspapers. And I think of those, all but two, which is the Sunday National and the National, are basically, inverted commas, pro-union. And that inevitably means that if there is something negative about the SNP or the SNP government, they will perhaps tend to highlight this more than they would negative stories about the UK government.
Thanks, Ian. That's a great perspective. I'm very grateful to you. Let's move on now, because Suella Braverman has said being homeless and living in a tent was a lifestyle choice. And yet she's the Home Secretary who is about to dump thousands of refugees out of hotels and onto the streets of the UK. Braverman has been rebuked by a senior Tory campaigner on homelessness after she provoked outrage by describing rough sleeping as a lifestyle choice. Bob Blackman MP, head of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Ending Homelessness, said Braverman was wrong to discuss a complex and serious issue in such terms, and he advised her to use wiser language. Braverman posted on X, formerly Twitter, that she plans to crack down on the pitching of tents in urban areas, which she largely blamed on individuals from abroad. She wrote, "We cannot allow our streets to be taken over by rows of tents occupied by people, many of them from abroad, living on the streets as a lifestyle choice." Bob Blackman, who set up the parliamentary group in 2016, told The Observer, "Homelessness for people from the UK is not a lifestyle choice, far from it." He went on, "Every case is unique. People would have ended relationships or fallen out with parents, which is why young people end up on the streets. They may have made the wrong choices in life or had an accident and be unable to work. I obviously would never use Braverman's words. She should use wiser words." Jen Clark, the economic and social right leads at Amnesty, said, "Of course the government likes to peddle the idea of intentional homelessness. It's a very convenient cop-out. But in truth, the spiralling housing crisis is a result of systematic government failure." She went on, we need to see housing recognised as a basic human right and protected in law so that we can hold the government to account. This is a useful distraction from any discussion about how far they are from delivering on their 2019 manifesto commitment to end rough sleeping. The homelessness charity Shelter said Braverman's comments were a sign of a failed government policy. No one should be punished for being homeless. criminalising people for sleeping in tents and making it an offence for charities to help them is unacceptable. Deciding whether to put or not to put sugar in your tea, or choosing to go on a park run or go to the pub on a Sunday afternoon, those are lifestyle choices. To imagine people sleeping in tents are either recreationally poor or optionally unhoused are the policy reflections of a maniac. In this, as in a range of other respects, the UK government seems to have completely lost the place. We're now more familiar with the dead-eyed sociopathy which is at the heart of the Braverman brand. Familiar as a recreational cruelty has now become to us, I don't think we should pass over the Home Secretary's latest intervention without noticing just how remarkably wicked it is. Imagine seeing fellow humans being huddled together under a canvas and thinking to yourself, that shelter needs to be confiscated. So, Marion, do you think, is the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, is she simply being performative to entertain the viewers of GB News and the readers of the Daily Mail, or is she serious?
Oh, she's still on a leadership bid, and she's still throwing red meat to the right-wing backbenchers who, and it seems to me that Rishi Sunak, for some reason or another, is afraid to sack her because some of her comments, not just on homelessness, but on the fact that people, who carry a Palestinian flag should be jailed, are just absolutely bonkers. I agree with shelter. I agree with amnesty. She is she seems to have in her political utterances absolutely no notion of common sense, no notion of why people fall into homelessness. I spoke to someone yesterday who was doing a bit of charity work and had gone out to speak to folk of a van that was helping feed homeless people, talking to someone who had been an accountant, who had had a good job, who had had quite a successful life, and through bad choices and through alcohol misuse had ended up homeless on the streets. Many of the other people on the streets have been put there by Suella Braverman and the Tory government's absolutely disgusting policy of no resource to public funds for refugees, people who are awaiting the Home Office decisions on whether they can or cannot stay in the UK, and whether or not they have so-called rights according to them, notwithstanding human rights and the UN Convention on Refugees. I'm lost for words when I try to describe why anyone, but especially another woman, would come out with remarks as calculated and as nasty as these.
Thanks, Marion. And just to expand that a little bit, it struck me as you were speaking, we heard evidence last week in the COVID inquiry from Dominic Cumming that his opinion was that Boris Johnson kept Matt Hancock as Health Secretary, despite Hancock's obvious shortcomings, but he kept Hancock in position because he was a useful idiot who would take the fall for everything. Do you think perhaps that Sunak is reflecting that and is keeping Braverman in position as a similarly useful distraction and potentially somebody to take the fall?
Possibly. But why? I mean, he's going to be tarnished if you think of it in the longer term. He's going to be tarnished by some of the remarks that she's making. But I think the Tory government is failing day by day as they look ahead and they can see absolutely no chance of getting re-elected. So many decent Tories have left or are standing down at the next election. And I think maybe he's just not prepared to move her because she might well be his useful idiot.
Thanks, Marion. Now, Ian, Suella Braverman seems to be consistent when she blames foreigners, and I suspect that her fans and supporters understand foreigners as being Braverman speak for brown people. Now, I must confess that I still really struggle to understand that attitude from her. So, Ian, is it as simple as Andrew Tickell describes her this morning? Is it as simple as she's simply a dead-eyed sociopath, or is there something else going on here?
I think she's certainly one of the most odious politicians that has held power in my lifetime. I look back at the Home Secretaries we had under Thatcher and under John Major. So you had people like Douglas Hurd, you had Kenneth Baker, you had Kenneth Clarke as UK Home Secretary in the 80s and the 90s. And, you may not have agreed with all their policies, but there was an inherent decency amongst these sorts of politicians. The trouble with Suella Braverman, and I really think she might be actually clinically insane, is that she sees everything through the prism of culture wars. Absolutely every topic. She wants to be divisive and to exaggerate things, to encourage racism, to encourage xenophobia, to encourage hatred of the other. And, the mere fact that she describes peaceful pro-Palestine marches, which in some cases have involved hundreds of thousands of people whose sole motive is the desire to see lives saved and peace in Gaza, in Palestine, as hate marches, I think speaks volumes. I mean, these are not hate marches. Yes, there might be a tiny fringe of a few, of a few people, maybe less than 100 who are extremists who want to eradicate Israel, but that doesn't make the whole march a hate march. I mean, I really don't understand this woman, and I really think she needs help, because she seems to be dangerous. She's stoking up division. She's stoking up hatred, and as I said, just compare her to Ken Clarke, Kenneth Baker, or Douglas Hurd, and she just shouldn't be in office. I think the only reason that Rishi Sunak invited her into his cabinet was because she supported his leadership bid just over a year ago. So he felt that he had to reward her because she had done that.
Thanks, Ian.
May I say something, Andrew?
Of course, Marion, please.
Yeah, I mean, what Ian said about former Home Secretaries, but when you look back even in the last 10 years with folk like Theresa May and Priti Patel, each one has got worse, and they have the Tory government. Well, they're all the same government, but different prime ministers have all encouraged this idea of othering people. I mean, Theresa May started it with her buses with the go home signatures on it. Priti Patel, another brown woman, which, defies logic, saying we can't have any more people coming here. And now, finally, in order to be better, inverted commas, than the first two, Suella Braverman has had to go into absolute overdrive.
Thanks, Marion. They do seem to be seeking to outdo each other with each successive Home Secretary at the moment. Yeah. But I was going to pivot with you for a little moment, and there's been discussion this week, I heard, with regard to the introduction of a broader suite of human rights, including housing. And in light of what Amnesty were saying, that housing should be introduced as a basic human right, Marion, do you think there's much prospect of housing being recognised as a basic human right, either in Westminster or alternatively at Holyrood?
Well, I think there is no doubt that shelter is a basic human right. And there are real economic reasons. And I listened to a very good discussion this morning on the shortage of housing. And although it's bad in Scotland, it's even worse, I think, in some places, especially places like London, down south. We need to get back. And of course, it all goes back to when social housing, council housing mainly, was sold off in the 80s and never replaced. And now we have, after Liz Truss's short-lived government, thank goodness, interest mortgage rates, all of that, it's a perfect storm, in fact, for housing. And we need to look perhaps at more innovative solutions, some of which some social enterprise organisations are looking at, just to get people off the streets and to provide parents and children with decent places to live. Now,
Thank you, Marion.
I don't have the day-to-day detail how to do that, but I think it's something well worth considering.
Thank you. Now, Ian, Shelter said criminalising people for sleeping in tents is unacceptable. But in addition, there's widespread reporting this weekend that the Home Secretary wants to make it an offence to, in her words, undermine the UK. So who or what do you think that Braverman wants to criminalise next? And should those folks who would prefer to perhaps to see an end to the UK, should they prepare themselves to be rounded up?
It's quite scary. I mean, the language sounds quite, bordering on the fascist. But I mean, there's a difference between criticising certain government policies, which where you have a free press and freedom of speech, it should be entirely possible and encouraged, and criticizing the whole country. And in any case, you can if you believe in freedom of the press and if you believe in freedom of speech, then any British person should be entitled to criticize the country or aspects of the country or things that are happening in the country. I mean, what she's proposing is quite chilling, to be honest. When did she make that suggestion? How recently was that? Was that like in the last few days, or was it? I don't know. Was it? Because I missed it. But I mean, in any case, she is. Sorry.
Yeah.
She's a very strange
It was reported
woman.
in the press yesterday, Ian.
Okay,
yes,
right.
Absolutely.
Well, she's a dangerous woman, and the mere fact that the thing she dreams about more than anything else is deporting asylum seekers to Rwanda, as she said at the Conservative Party conference year before last, is quite extraordinary. Why should this be the thing she dreams about more than anything else? I mean, it's not about fairness. It's not about promoting a more inclusive society. It's about promoting hatred of the other. And her suggestion that she should somehow make it a crime to criticize the UK, I mean, that is very dangerous territory.
Thanks, Ian. I appreciate your thoughts and perspective on that. Let's move on now, though, because the other big story of the week has been AI. Now, to clear this up from the beginning, when I say AI, I mean artificial intelligence, not artificial insemination, as Cliff Richard thinks, not astonishing incompetence, which might be taken to refer to any recent Prime Minister, and certainly not absolute inhumanity, which might equally easily refer to the current Home Secretary. In some ways, the last 2 days have marked a real move forward in AI regulation. There's now an explicit consensus to take on an international shared responsibility. There are plans for further meetings in South Korea and France over the next year to continue the conversations surrounding the risks posed by AI. However, critics have said that the focus on the more hypothetical aspects of existential threats, as opposed to the more current pressing problems, like insurance companies using AI to determine your risk, or AI's potential to take people's jobs, dilutes the impact of the summit. Discussions about AI often focus on the futuristic threat posed by superhuman intelligence, but AI is already woven into the fabric of our daily lives, the way we travel, the food we eat, how we spend our money, the news we read, and our social interactions. The influence of AI is everywhere. This phone uses AI to allow me to unlock it using facial recognition, even after I grow a beard. You don't need to tell TikTok your tastes or interest. It rapidly gauges this from your reactions, whether you watch a video partly or to the end, share it or skip past it. As you scroll and click, TikTok uses AI to refine its profile of your personality and interests and uses this to predict which content will keep you most engaged. And Tesco has been quick to adopt AI to optimize delivery routes taken by drivers and has been trialling the use of heavily automated AI urban fulfillment centres, in which robots and conveyor belts are used to retrieve and drop off pallets of goods. They have also pioneered the use of analytics to predict consumer behaviour, correlating demand for specific products with the weather, changes in the economy, and regional demographics. So, Ian, notwithstanding the somewhat stomach-churning love-in between Elon Musk and Rishi Sunak earlier this week, do you think that we yet have a proper handle and control on the rapid development and implementation of this new technology?
No, I don't think we do. I mean, I think it's existing in a regulatory vacuum, more or less. And I think that Rishi Sunak's knee-jerk response, which is to basically, go for the light touch regulatory approach, is misguided. I think, on Monday, Joe Biden signed an executive order which mandated a wide range of controls to protect US citizens against malevolent use of AI. I mean, I haven't read this in its entirety, but according to The Guardian, this is a sprawling, detailed agenda which covers the threat of cyber weapons proliferation, consumer protection, the prospect of AI machines undermining workplace rights, the risk that algorithms derived from biased data sets will embed social inequalities in automated systems, etc. So, I mean, it looks to me that in this area, Biden's administration is going down the right route. They've introduced this executive order last Monday, whereas it seems to me that Rishi Sunak is more of a kind of laissez-faire type of guy, and he basically would follow the approach that Gordon Brown, Ed Balls, and Peter Mandelson pursued to with bankers between '97 and 2008, which is just let them get on with it. Let's either dismantle or weaken the regulations because bankers know best. We can trust them to act responsibly, etc., etc. And we know where that ended. But it seems to me that Sunak is wishing to pursue a similar sort of laissez-faire approach with AI, or that's the impression I got from his summit last week. And I think that he needs to be careful about that.
Thanks, Ian. And Marion, what are your thoughts? Do you think that the development and implementation, the rapid development and implementation of artificial intelligence, do you think it has the potential to pose a threat either to individuals or to communities?
Well, absolutely. And I think the fact that the US are already, there's this presidential executive order, and the EU are going to bring out regulations soon, it speaks volumes for how Rishi Sunak is doing it. And I have to say, Ian, that was a fabulous analogy with banking and Gordon Brown, Ed Balls, etc., and Rishi Sunak and AI. Talking about it isn't actually going to make it go away. We need to have some sort of regulation to protect people, jobs, all sorts of other things. And at the same time, without being Luddite, we have to grasp some things that AI are, uses that AI is being put to just now are really giving us great breakthroughs medically, where we're now able to diagnose people much quicker because of the way AI can deal with the data that's extrapolated from tests, and actually get people into a medical treatment way much, much sooner. So there are advantages, but we need to have the regulation so that AI, I suppose, in common talk, would be that it can't go rogue. Stephen Hawking did say something along those lines before he died. If AI is allowed to go about its business unhindered, and it can develop its own imagination and develop by itself, which is a possibility, then it could be to the detriment of the human race. So we have to have some form of regulation, and we're better starting now than later.
Thanks, Marion. And I was actually going to ask you about the politics of that executive order. As you say, the US Vice President Kamala Harris stole some of Sunak's thunder as she arrived at Bletchley Park with a freshly minted White House executive order on AI. It lays out an actionable plan that the US government will take, including setting up its own institute that would police artificial intelligence. Now, with all of the noise and brouhaha of the summit, it may be missed that Sunak does not have plans with anything like as much detail to match. Though he insisted that he welcomed the US intervention, I think it made clear that the UK was not setting the agenda. So, Marion, does that come as any surprise at all post-Brexit?
No, and I think that wasn't the point of Brexit, correct me if I'm wrong, was to let the UK do its own thing and be first and be best and just get on with things. And there's the US and now the EU going to regulate, and where's the UK? Trailing behind. It's not the way we should be going. Absolutely not.
Thanks, Marion. And Ian, in a slightly broader sense, thinking about this slightly more broadly, do you think is the key challenge of of artificial intelligence? Is the challenge the technology, or on the other hand, is it the corporations and the individuals who control the technology?
It's probably a mixture, but I think the main problem is that, you know, the ultimate goal of any private corporation is to enrich its own shareholders, not to set down, you know, moral limits or ethical limits on what they do or do not do. And I think the spectacle of Rishi Sunak, you know, obsequiously interviewing Elon Musk in front of in Lancaster, was it Lancaster House in London on Friday, was actually quite sickening, and it was probably symptomatic of his overall approach. He is deferring to these titans of the tech world. You know, he thinks they know best. It's a bit like Brown, as I said, Brown and the bankers, and you know, he thinks. He's more interested in that than in any concern for the impact that their products are having on things like precarious jobs, on workers, on schools, or indeed at the ballot box via electoral manipulation. You know, here I am referring to the Guardian article again. It was quite a good leader in the Guardian last week, but yeah, I think there's a real danger that Sunak is in the thrall of these tech titans, and that he doesn't actually understand the risks that AI may present or does already present.
Thanks, Ian. And let's move on now to our final item, because ahead of the King's speech, the SNP has called for Scotland to get control over cost of living powers. The upcoming King's speech must deliver vital support for mortgages and energy bills, the SNP's leader at Westminster has said. The King's speech, to be delivered by Charles on Tuesday, but of course written by the UK government, will set out the legislative agenda for the upcoming parliamentary session. But Stephen Flynn has taken aim at Rishi Sunak, telling him his first and last King's speech must deliver energy and employment powers to Holyrood, while reintroducing a £400 energy bill rebate, mortgage interest tax relief, and action on food prices. Mr. Flynn said, this King's speech will almost certainly be Rishi Sunak's first and last. The Tories trashed the economy and they deserve to be booted out of government. Westminster has failed millions of families across Scotland who have seen their incomes hammered due to UK government incompetence, showing why it is essential Scotland gets full control over cost of living powers to boost the economy and household incomes. He went on, Scotland needs full powers over energy, employment and the economy so we can take action where Westminster has comprehensively failed and offer people in Scotland a wealthier and fairer future. So, Ian, inspired by the statement from Stephen Flynn yesterday, maybe cost of living powers, or what powers do you think ought to be devolved to Scotland and handed to the Scottish Government now?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say I think Stephen Flynn has done in my view, he's done a pretty good job, since taking over from Ian Blackford as the Westminster leader of the SNP. I mean, as far as the actual range of powers or the suite of powers that you demand is concerned, that an SNP Westminster leader demands is concerned, you know, he's probably chosen the ones here which could have some impact, you know, were they used more sensibly, and one would hope that a Scottish government would use them more sensibly. These powers could actually improve people's fortunes and people's economic well-being in Scotland if they were devolved. But the trouble is that I don't think that Sunak's government is going to hand over any powers. You know, they are basically, you just have to see Alistair Jack speak or other senior cabinet ministers in Rishi Sunak's government, and they are not inclined. The current government is not inclined to hand over any further powers to Scotland. So I doubt whether Stephen Flynn is going to achieve much with this, I'm afraid.
Thanks, Ian. And Marion, the same question for you. What it could be cost of living powers, or it could be something else. What do you think should be devolved from Westminster to Holyrood now?
I mean, employment law is probably a good one to deploy just now, because that would give us more power over how much people get paid, and that may well help. It would help cost of living. I should say, Ian. I should say, Andrew. I have a bit of a fight over this. The King's speech meant that Parliament had to be prorogued, and I was supposed to be speaking in a debate on a social energy tariff, which would really help people during the cost of living, in addition to what Stephen's already said about the energy payment and all of the other things that we really need, because the Scottish Government is hamstrung. We mitigate as much as we can for the deficiencies of the Tory government at Westminster, but it can't always mitigate for everything on a fixed budget. So, I could. And I firmly believe that if Scotland were independent, we would do things differently. But at the moment, Rishi, in my 8.5 years, I think it is, at Westminster, the one thing I still find absolutely incredible is that very few people, if any, on the front benches for the Tory government and the back benches understand how difficult it is for ordinary people to live. We're now being taxed more. We're now, prices are higher. The energy bills next winter are going to be horrendous. And, that was partly why I wanted to get a debate going on a social energy tariff, because I'm continually in talks with disability organisations, with carers, and they are really dreading. Last winter was bad enough. Next winter will probably be worse, because they have the debt from last winter, as well as what they're going to be paying extra for the winter coming up. And no one in the UK government seems to understand or even care that that's the case.
Thanks, Marion. I'm very grateful to you for summing that up for us, because I'm afraid that's all that we have time for this afternoon. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland depends on the generosity of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news and current affairs. Please help us to continue to make these programmes and to develop the station. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Our need to reach our £30,000 target to pay our bills is still pressing. However, the generosity of our supporters has given us a little more time. We've raised over £20,400 now, and so we've been able to continue making programmes, but we do need to raise the remaining £9,600 immediately. To everyone who has donated, and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you'd like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on X and on Blue Sky at Broadcast Scot. Please like and retweet us there. And when you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. We will be back at 7 p.m. sharp tomorrow evening for the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please come and join us then. I'd like to thank everyone who's been watching this afternoon, and of course, I'd like to give a very special thanks to our very special guests, Ian Fraser and Marion Fellows MP. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
On this day in 1879 saw the death at the age of 48 in Cambridge from abdominal cancer of James Clerk Maxwell, one of the greatest scientists of any era. His nickname of Dafty was earned by wearing homemade shoes on his first day at his new school. But in 1931, on the centenary of his birth, Albert Einstein described Maxwell's work as the most profound and the most fruitful that physics has experienced since the time of Newton. Please look after yourselves, and please have a very peaceful weekend. Bye-bye.